Hello and welcome back to another episode of This Week in Christian History. And this week we are focused on our episode beginning October the 6th, which also happens to be the day that we're focused on, which is October the 6th, 1536, which is the day that William Tyndale was burned at the stake. And we have a professor of English at James Mason University. Dr. Mark Rankin is with us to talk about Tyndale and particularly some of his obvious influence in the development of the English Bible and what all is involved with that. So, Dr. Rankin, thank you so much for making time for us today.
Thanks for having me. And it's James Madison University.
Oh, what did I say? James Mason?
Yeah,
I'm really banking it today, aren't I? Okay, sorry about that. Yes,
words.
the Constitution guy, right? I mean, so that would be part of it. Still, I still get Virginia though, right? I mean, so I get a little bit of that. James Madison. All right, my bad. So, uh, tell us a little bit about who Tyndale was. I mean, where did he? Why him? Why is he the guy that we would be talking about as it relates to translating the Bible?
Uh, okay. Well, William Tyndale was the first person to print an English translation of the Bible. And that is really sort of his claim to fame, as it were. He was born in the west of England. He was from Gloucester, and he was educated at Oxford. He did his Bible translation work in Antwerp and in the Low Countries, also Germany. Um, he uh, he was strangled and then burned as a heretic in outside of Brussels at a place called Vilvoorde Castle in 1536. Um, why him?
Yeah,
Because he did it.
he's the guy that stepped up.
I mean, in a manner of speaking, yes. There's a tendency to, in some circles, I think, to think think of him in the wrong way. He was a very, very skilled translator. He was a courageous person.
Hmm.
Uh, he um, he accomplished something that had not been accomplished, but had he not done so, it would have happened and someone else would have done it. And so he's not a saint, um, in my view. And he is not the greatest thing since sliced bread to happen to the English language, as some have said. So for me, Tyndale is, I like to talk about his achievement in historical terms rather than in
Hmm.
hagiographical terms, if you will.
Hmm. But now, was he a professor at Oxford?
Uh, no, no,
He just was trained at
no,
Oxford. Okay.
he was trained at Oxford. Um, he was not a professor at all. He was ordained as a priest. He spent time as a tutor in the west of England. He did a lot of translation work there in terms of some Greek stuff. And then he was, a translator. His support came from Lutheran merchants, Lutheran English merchants
Really?
out of London and also out of Antwerp, where he lived for a number of years before his arrest.
Is part of that support then kind of when he knew he was in the crosshairs of Henry and others, right? Of Henry VIII, I guess, and the others. Is that why he felt like that was a place he could go to
That's
actually
right.
do the
So
printing?
yeah, and so there's a lot to say here.
Good.
Hi- his first biographer is John Fox, in his Acts and Monuments, or so-called Book of Martyrs.
Hmm.
Fox tells a story that has been influential and has really been unchallenged. And I think that's not necessarily a good thing. But with that caveat, Tyndale wanted to translate the Bible. He couldn't find permission to do that in England, within England. There were laws on the books at the time that required permission from the church to translate the Bible into English. And so he went to the continent of Europe, and he eventually landed in Antwerp, where there were established like commercial relationships with English merchants, and they brought a great deal of money into the city. And so, even though Antwerp was under the control of the Holy Roman Emperor, who was
Hmm.
Catholic, the authorities tended to look the other way. And in some ways, it was the best place for Tyndale for that reason, because his supporters were bringing so much income into the city that it was, for a time, a place to be for him. Now, the other very important piece is that it was not illegal to translate the Bible into any vernacular language in Antwerp in those days. And so he was not doing anything that was um, illegal per se. He got into trouble more for his Lutheran views, and his eventual execution was for those beliefs more so than the act of translating the Bible, if that makes sense.
Sure, sure, sure. But that was, but well, how did he? I get the impression, and please straighten me on this if my impression is wrong on it, is that Henry VIII was much saw the opportunity to use him as a more of a political tool to be ingratiated more to the Pope than it was about him being some heretic. Oh, we got to go clean get these. They weren't Protestants known as Protestants then, but right, these heretical people that have all this stuff that's coming from Luther. I'm more worried about, you know, kissing up to the Pope
Right.
than I am worried about getting rid of these folks.
Well, I wouldn't quite put it like that.
Okay.
But to sort of just look at the political side from a slightly different angle. Henry VIII initially opposed Luther. He published a ghost-written book in his name called The Assertion of the Seven Sacraments against Luther. There was a battle of books, if you will, that followed. This was about 15 years before Tyndale's death. And then between those publications and Tyndale's activities, Henry VIII got this idea to divorce his wife. And he wanted to do it through the church, and he pursued the Catholic Church, and he pursued various routes that all ended up uh, leading him nowhere. And so he eventually took it upon himself. He threw the Pope out of England, but he wasn't a Protestant by any stretch. He was simply
No.
anti-papal. During all of that controversy, there was considerable pressure on people like Tyndale to come out in favor or against. In fact, when Tyndale was in Antwerp, agents of Thomas Cromwell, who was Henry VIII's sort of chief minister,
Hmm.
tried to persuade Tyndale to return. And Tyndale said, this is recorded in letters, that he would return um, if the king would license an English Bible, which didn't happen, and so he didn't return. Now, there are a couple of ironies to this. The first irony is that so Tyndale printed the New Testament, and he printed um, uh, Genesis up through Deuteronomy, and he translated up to Chronicles. But the first English Bible completely was the Coverdale Bible, and that was working with Tyndale's public, like his printed translations, and then working from the Latin. So Tyndale translated from the Hebrew, and the early Bibles that were very soon authorized after Tyndale's death, they used Tyndale's material. And so, in a way, even though he was executed, um, his translation was the translation that was available. But why was he? Why did Henry not try to rescue him? The real reason is that Tyndale wrote a book called The Practice of Prelates in 1530. He wrote a few books other than his translation work, and in this book, he offended both sides. So he tells a history of the medieval church in which priests and clerics are always stealing power from kings and emperors.
Hmm.
And so the divorce, he says, is just the latest iteration of that. And the priest and Cardinal Thomas Wolsey was behind it. He was the mastermind. That was the argument. And so he offended the church for this. But he also had an entire chapter in which he argues on theological grounds that Henry should stay married to Catherine. So he offended Henry as well. And so he offended both sides of the debate. And that's why I believe Henry did not exert diplomatic pressure to get him out, as it were. And so that was what offended Henry in a way more than the Bible itself, although it was very controversial to read an English Bible in the 1520s in England. Um, but uh, there were government forces and the international political scene that had various things going on that were different from the ordinary person reading a Bible, right? And so, in a way, those two dynamics are interacting. Um, that is, there's a grassroots English Reformation, and then there's an
Hmm.
official Reformation from above. And the Bible functions differently in those two separate arenas.
Huh. And so, I mean, why was that so controversial? I mean, for them to be actually read the Bible in English, was
Well,
that
you were asking me earlier about Wycliffe.
right?
And so there were medieval English translations, partial translations that circulated, and they were associated with the Lollard heresy,
Okay.
which was a homegrown sort of medieval heresy. And the reason why I mentioned earlier that there was a requirement for uh, church permission to translate the Bible was because of the Lollards. So in other places in Europe,
Uh,
this was not in place. And in fact, when Tyndale printed his translation in 1526, most European vernaculars, especially Western European vernaculars, already had an English vernacular Bible because printing had been around for, by that point, 75 years.
hmm.
And so it was, in some ways, it was the Lollards who created this situation where people were afraid of sort of that coming back. And
Right.
that's why an English Bible was problematic.
Well, I'm assuming too, the church couldn't go back on, look, you go dig a guy up and and burn his bones to make the point, like
Right.
Wycliffe. I mean, you've obviously made the point. This is not cool for for people to do this, and so you're not going to backtrack on any of that, right? I mean, so if that's kind of the standard of the day, and people understand that, even though we're talking about 100 and whatever it was years before that, before when all
Right.
that took place of the of, it still was standard enough to go, this is not okay because the church is not going to be okay with you doing this. Is that
In a manner of speaking.
is that a matter of is
I mean,
that a
it was
simplistic
about
way of saying?
it was about power and control.
Sure,
The reason why the Reformation um, lasted is because ordinary people started reading the Bible in their own language, and then they started having ideas of their own, ideas about how kings should treat us, and ideas about what say we should have in our own, in the government of our own country. Things that were charged, like politically charged. Um,
sure.
and it started with Luther, and then it just spread. And so that was in some ways what the church in England was afraid of. Um, but there were reformers prior to Luther, and so the Reformation grows out of a reform movement. People like Erasmus and others
Sure.
who are trying to change the church from within, as it were. So the strands are very complicated and very interwoven.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that like I tell my students sometimes this is a protesters wanting to reform. That's the we need to think about it that some, all right, Calvin and others like to rip it out by the roots, but I mean that there was still plenty of people who just were trying to reform what they protested was not the right way to go. This is not necessarily they're trying to create some brand new denomination or some other piece to put on.
Well, Luther never looked back once he got in a fight with the
Yeah,
church. I would say that.
that's
I mean, he once he broke with the Pope excommunicated him. He burned the bull of excommunication.
right.
And um, yeah, so uh, that's what I would say.
Yeah. Well, but the kind of the geopolitical thing, as you were talking about earlier too. I mean, one of the political things that certainly, as I understand it, was on the Pope's mind was I'm not about back to the divorce, right, between
Right.
Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. I'm not about to give Charles V's aunt no, a
Right.
divorce and
Right.
something. I mean, we're not going to grant that, particularly because she had not done anything whatsoever that even merited anything like that to
So
do.
we have to get out of our minds this idea of meritorious divorce. Kings divorced people all the time in the Middle Ages, and popes could be bought for the right price. The unique problem that Henry VIII faced was that Charles V, who, as you mentioned, Nick, was Catherine of Aragon's nephew. He was the Holy Roman Emperor. He was the King of Spain. He was the most powerful monarch in Europe. And in 1529, he sacked Rome and put the Pope under house arrest. And so that was the Pope's problem. If that hadn't happened, the divorce would have been granted. I
Oh,
believe
yeah.
that.
Oh.
And so yeah, and so that was the whole political side to it. Um, and of course, Catherine had been for your listeners. It's important to remember as well that
Hmm.
Catherine had been married to Henry VIII's brother, Arthur Tudor, who died and then she was a widow for, I don't know, 6, 7 years, something like that,
Hmm.
before she marries Henry. And so, in order to get so that marriage, the marriage to one's former sister-in-law, fell within the prohibited degrees of close affiliation, right, for the Catholic Church's rules of that time. And so Henry VIII had to obtain papal permission for the marriage. And so the question that was before him was, was that permission sort of in the legal process in the courts that led to that? Were there any discrepancies that he could have latched onto? But there was also sort of the moral ethical argument that, is marriage to one's sister-in-law displeasing to God? Because according to an interpretation of Leviticus, it
Hmm.
was. The problem was for Henry that Deuteronomy appeared to command such a marriage.
Right. The
And
kinsman
so,
redeemer
what's
idea,
that?
right? The kinsman redeemer idea, right?
Well, no, this is the if your brother dies, marry your brother's wife and produce offspring for the brother. And so in the canon law and in the debate, it was Henry's lawyers against Catherine's. And Henry believed that God was angry with him because he hadn't produced an heir. Had
Ah.
Catherine produced a son who lived beyond infancy, the whole thing would have been moot. And so it was all about his desire to perpetuate his dynasty following the Wars of the Roses and the instability of the Tudor line.
Hmm.
And so that was what was going on politically. And then Tyndale shows up and he prints a Bible, right? And so the printed Bible, the printed New Testament is best seen against that canvas, that political backdrop.
Wow. And there's never a quick answer, right? For any of this stuff, because that's
Never.
part of why we study it. That's part of why we enjoy being able to. Hey, we're having a great conversation here with Dr. Mark Rankin, and we're talking about William Tyndale and on the occasion of his martyrdom, death, murder, depending on which way you want to be. I think some of all of that, right? Maybe part of that to do. So how much so for uh, a great deal of the King James, right, was took from some of the translations, right, that Tyndale had done.
Well, this is Tyndale's sort of his greatest point of originality is his skill as a translator. He, despite what some earlier scholars have argued, he was not an original theologian. He got ideas from Luther, from Erasmus. He tweaked things here and there, but he was a man in exile on the run, reading the two most prolific authors of his day, Luther and
Mm.
Erasmus, who were both theologians. And so his theological work, he commented on the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7. He commented on First John, and he draws from those things. Now, in his translation, he coined a number of phrases and words that are very common, familiar to us. Things like, "Am I my brother's keeper?" "The salt of the earth," etc. And indeed, the King James translation does take a lot of his of his verbiage via a transmission line of other 16th century English Bibles. The so-called Great Bible,
Hmm.
Coverdale, the Matthew Bible in between, so 1535, 37, 39, the Geneva Bible, the Bishop's Bible, the Douay-Rheims Bible, even the Catholic Bible uses some Tyndale. And so in a way, it was more about why change a good thing than it was, oh, we have to keep Tyndale because we're just revering Tyndale.
I got you.
And in fact, Tyndale was problematic in the decades following his death for various theological reasons. After Mary Tudor brought England back to Catholicism, a number of the leading intellectuals, the leading so-called evangelicals, they went to Geneva, they went to Frankfurt, they went to these cities on the continent. They fell under the influence of Calvin, and they came back with theological ideas that were different from Tyndale's Lutheranism. For example, Tyndale believed that the souls of departed Christians did not immediately experience an afterlife. They rested until the Last Judgment. He was very clear on that, but Calvin did not accept that, and under Queen Elizabeth, Tyndale's views were no longer acceptable for the established church. There were other things on the Lord's presence in the Eucharist. And so when John Foxe brought out an edition of Tyndale's writings in 1573, he made a number of changes to sort of clean him up, as it were. And he
Huh.
used printed notes in order to point the reader to places where Tyndale had gone astray, as it were. And so in a way, Tyndale was a theologian of his moment more than anything else. And his translation endured insofar as the verbiage I mentioned because it was the best translation available. Like it was correct. If the translation is correct and is becomes familiar, why change it?
Right, right. There's no reason to go back and do it again.
Right.
We've already translated it enough to for that to work out. So, um, what a fascinating character and a fascinating time, that really kind of fits into so many different pieces and parts. I mean, you could look at this whole story of him from any different angle, right? But kind of where he fits in, what's going on around him, what's going on behind him, things that he's stirred up his own trouble, places where he didn't stir up his own trouble, but he was caught in the middle of all of it, right? So it's just as I've told my students on a number of occasions, Jesus didn't give the 12 apostles a three-ring binder and say this is exactly the way you're gonna put this thing together, right? And so when you take an authority out and you're not listening to the Pope anymore, it's the Wild West, right? You can come up with, maybe not total Wild West, but you're at least getting some different ideas. You got different opinions based on how you're reading it. But what am I reading? Well, what I'm reading is what
Right.
is getting translated, right?
Well, on
So,
that point, he wanted to get the Bible into the hands of the common reader, and he felt that to do so would be like he wasn't necessarily uh, challenging the church per se. He was more interested in helping people see the ways in which the church in place had gone away from Scripture, right? And so, um, yeah, that I mean that was his goal. He felt that getting the text as it if translated into good English from its original language would help people to think better about their religious views.
hmm kind of, I mean, is it fair to say he kind of picked up on Luther's priesthood of the believer kind of mindset that you in the
He
scripture
did.
can figure these things out and you
He
don't have
did.
to
He did, but
translate.
this is where I would really push hard against people who want to see him as some kind of Protestant saint because that's what Fox did. Fox called him the Apostle of England in this our latter day, this our latter age, clearly setting him up as a kind of Pauline figure. And he has sort of been viewed among some in some circles in that way ever since. But he was profoundly influential in the way we think about politics. You know, his view for just for example, um,
Mhm.
that that following the Peasants' Revolt of 1525, early Protestants and and early Lutherans were forced to defend their views against rebellion. That is, this argument that Protestantism had caused rebellion. And Tyndale wrote a book called The Obedience of a Christian Man, in which he said, look, obey the king. And this early position that, the king is under God with authority, the so-called divine right of kings,
Hmm.
was very influential in England, leading down to the English Civil War. It wasn't until later that, after Mary came to the throne, and meanwhile in France, there's this long civil war in the second half of the 16th century,
Hmm.
when people begin to say, wait a second, maybe an individual can take arms against a tyrannical king. And this led to some royal assassinations. But anyway, that comes later. Tyndale is um, very hierarchical in his view of monarchical authority. And so he fits into, in some ways, what Henry VIII was trying to do. Supposedly, although I don't believe it, Henry VIII said, this is a book for me and all kings to read when he read the book. That's in Fox. Um, and it dates from decades later. But we have to understand Tyndale in his time, and yeah, the idea that he is the apostle of England, coming down to some of the things that his 20th century biographers have said, really it departs from serious scholarship, frankly.
Hmm.
Um, and so we have a need for a good biography of him.
How
There
about
is
that?
no good biography of Tyndale.
Oh, really?
I mean, David Daniel, the most recent biographer, I was at a conference this past summer, and one very senior scholar who was there, he described Daniel as astonishingly not curious about Tyndale, that he just follows Fox. And Fox has a huge agenda in the way that he frames Tyndale's.
Sure.
And so again, Tyndale did something that someone else would have done. I mean, I actually think that his accomplishment is less than uh, it is seen in some places, but his actual accomplishment is not fully understood, right?
Mm.
This idea that um, that he, I mean, he helped Fox see what was really, in a way, a kind of minority worldview. This notion that priests and clerics are inherently hostile to monarchs. That was what he said in the Practice of Prelates, and that view could not hold any ground once the English Church became established. King James said, "No bishop, no king," right? And but yet it was that position that fuels Fox in his Book of Martyrs and how he presents his entire history of the church, right?
Sure.
And from Fox, that's where so many generations of Protestant readers get their ideas that Catholicism is the Antichrist and so on.
Mm.
But that's from Fox, and Fox gets that from Tyndale. So his actual influence should be clarified against hagiography, which is really following in the footsteps of his early biographers.
Do you think he would not have been you, his martyrdom, his murder is all of that? Had that not happened to him, I wonder how much history would have paid as much attention to him.
Um,
Outside of maybe outside
well,
of academic world that would have gone, yes, thank you. That's great scholarship.
I,
Appreciate what you've done. Thank you so much, William. We're going to the
I
next
think
guy.
that history would have noticed him. But again, we have to understand his execution even properly. He was in Antwerp, as I mentioned. If you don't mind, could I just give a narrative?
Absolutely,
Yeah, so he
please.
was in
We
Antwerp,
love it.
and he was enjoying the protection of these English merchants living in a merchant's hostel called the English House. And there was a day when most of them were away uh, for some kind of a meeting, and he was betrayed to the troops of Charles V by an Englishman called Harry Phillips. And Phillips was um, a bit of a scoundrel. He had fled the country and most likely had stolen from money from his own father.
Mm,
He was trying to ingratiate himself back into his family's good graces. He was looking for a buck, and he agreed to hand Tyndale over. And so they came and they got him, but they took him to a prison that was owned by the emperor. So it was an imperial prison, and there he was interrogated by theologians from the University of Leuven, which was the leading Catholic university of the region, and executed there. Now Fox says that his dying words were, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes," but his dying words were a scream because that's what martyrs say when they're killed, right? Um, Lord, open the King of England's eyes is a phrase that comes from Tyndale's books. And the reason I know this is that there was no way. So Fox writes his account and all of his biography from informants and from his own research into various records. But nobody, uh, there's no connection between Fox and this prison that he was executed inside the castle. I mean, it's the emperor's own castle. Like no one comes in or goes out that doesn't have permission to be there. And so Fox makes that up. So the idea that he's a martyr is that argument comes from the Book of Martyrs. Now I'm not saying that he isn't a martyr. I mean, history calls him a martyr, but he was also a heretic, right? So, one man's martyr was another man's heretic.
mm,
It was the cause, not the suffering, that made a martyr. So in the 16th century, half of Europe would have said that he was not a martyr. And we tend to think about the suffering that makes the martyr. And so,
right.
yeah,
Or for the cause that you've died for, right? I mean,
the cause. So
suffering to, right.
if you die for the incorrect cause, you're not a martyr,
Yeah. Right.
right? And so the actual death and the circumstances that led up to the death were shaped and massaged and manipulated by an editor who wants to present Tyndale as one of the heroes of this story,
Hmm.
and he puts
Hmm.
him in this line of others who had suffered for their faith, and he smooths over all of the theological differences of these individuals, and he presents them as like unified for this cause, and that really wasn't the case.
Mm.
And so it was an agenda-driven publication that sort of cemented this notion that, oh, Tyndale was a martyr. Um, and oh, what did Tyndale do? So he translated the Bible. So he must have died for translating the Bible, right? No, he didn't. He died because he was a Lutheran. Again, digging into the real story.
No, no,
Yeah.
that's why we're here. It's what we do. It's why we enjoy being able to kick these things around, and that's really why we're glad we have folks like you that help us think about some different things that might not that have done the research and the scholarship, right? I mean, you're not going to get all that on Wikipedia, right? I mean, so we don't we want to make sure that we're trying to be as close to the truth as we can and be able to unpack and dig into specifics as part of what this whole Center for Christian History is about. So,
Hmm.
Dr. Mark Rankin, thank you so much for your time. We
You're
really
welcome.
appreciate you being able to shed some light and to help us learn a heck of a lot more about William Tyndale. And I'm always the student in these things. So I'm always the learner, okay, and all of this stuff. So thanks again for taking time with us.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
Okay.